Hi, and welcome to my OpenTK 2D game engine series. I'm going to call this a game engine, but think of this more as a framework. It will be a reusable library that will work very similar to Monogame. We'll be using OpenTK in .NET 6 and make use some of the latest and greatest C# features. This is by no means meant to be the best way to make use of this. Quite frankly, if your goal is to create a game using C#, I would recommend you use the Monogame framework or Unity. That will get you up and running very quickly. This tutorial series is more for people who want to learn how to create a game engine mostly from scratch. We're obviously going to be using OpenTK. We might use a third-party library for audio, potentially for input. All that's kind of TBD at this point. So the inspiration for this series is this is not a topic you can really go and Google and find anything recent or really all that relevant. The OpenTK website does have a tutorial series, but that tutorial series was written for an older version of OpenTK, and a lot of the code that they list there does not match their GitHub. So, while it seems like if you're already familiar with OpenGL, that would be fine. You should be able to follow along just fine, but if you're not and you're brand new to it, I think that it can be kind of confusing to follow along, or at least that was my experience when I first started this. So, with all that out of the way, let's get started. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a console application. Click Next, and we shall call it Mystic. How about we'll keep it generic, game engine.tk. Sure. We'll use .NET 6. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to immediately add our NuGet packages here for OpenTK. Yep, we'll use the latest stable version. And we'll want OpenTK.mathematics as well. Alright, now we're back into our code editor, and let's go ahead and add the boilerplate code that Visual Studio no longer supplies automatically. Let's make sure that runs, and we're good to go. Alright. So next we're going to add another project to this here, because remember this is going to be a reusable project. This can be a class library. We'll call it GameEngine.tk.core. Will be a .NET 6. Okay. So now we have that. Let's go ahead and rename this to game. Sure. Now we'll want some properties added to this. So first what we'll want is a protected initial window width. To track the window height, we'll need to have a private game window settings. And that is right, we need to add OpenTK. import Windows.desktop for this. We'll just give it game window settings, default, and then we need native Windows settings. And we'll also go with the default for now. And then now, yeah, we'll also want a title. And then that should just about cover it. Alright, yeah, so let's go ahead and generate a constructor for this. We'll move this up high. And actually I want the constructor to stay down here. That should be fine. Then we will, inside the constructor, those values are good. We will come back to setting the window size for now, but let's just get some of the initial structure in place so we can get something up and running for our base framework here. So let's have a method to have it run. So we'll call this run. And we're gonna want some, yes, this will be a partial class because we want to inherit from this class. So let's create a protected void initialize protected load content. This is all probably looking very, very similar to mono game. So protected update. We'll eventually have a game time object that will be populating in there next. Okay. Sorry, I meant to say this is a abstract class. Okay, there we go. That should fix the errors. Okay, so just want to walk through here what we've created just to make sure all this makes sense. We're having some properties that we're going to use to have an OpenTK window that's going to get created. We're going to have a run method which fires everything off, and then we'll have initialize, load content, update, and render. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to know the game time. We're going to need to know what's the total game time and how many seconds have lapsed from the last frame. So let's add a new class and we will call it game time. And it can stay in that namespace, make it public. So we'll get a public time span, total game time. And we'll call this one lapse game time. And we can go ahead and generate a constructor for this as well. And I think it's okay, we'll have just a blank constructor as well. I don't think it's all that necessary. We can use it really however we want. Let's move this up high. Yeah, I think that's all it is. This is really just going to be a model that kind of represents it. Everything is going to be set from outside of it within our run method. So now let's bring this into our game class, and we'll pass in game time. We may need to pass this into the render method as well. We'll create a sprite batch similar to mono game as well here that we'll pass in, but for now we'll go ahead and put that in there. So now what we need to do is we need to create a OpenTK window. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to call initialize, so anything that's inheriting from this will have some initializations that take place. And we will have a game window, which is OpenTK's, and we'll just call it game window, new game game window settings and the native Windows settings. We'll instantiate the game time class. And we need to call the load content method. So OpenTK has a method for us to hook onto. It's load, I believe. Load, yes. So we'll call load content. And then we need to have our main game loop here, and we'll just make use of OpenTK's here. We need the frame, event, args. So we'll need to get the current time, which is part of this event args object, and that's a double, so we'll set the game time elapsed time to equal time span dot from milliseconds, which is time right here. So this is how many milliseconds or seconds have elapsed, or milliseconds, yes, that have elapsed since the last frame. And then we want to keep the total time, so we can just do game time dot total game time plus equals time span from milliseconds, and then time, and then we'll call the update method passing in our game time object, and that should suffice for our game loop for now. We'll also need to have a game window render frame, so this will be our draw function, and that's the same thing, frame event args. And then we'll call render. And then for now, we're going to have swap buffers get called from out here. And swap buffers. We may come back and change this, but that's good enough for now. And then we'll call game window run. And that's the run method for the game window object, so the OpenTK game window that we created. I did miss one thing in the game time. I think we should have some initialization and just set it to 0. It probably does by default, but we'll keep things clean. Okay. Alright, so now what we're going to want to do is we'll add a reference in our original project up here to core. You can just do that by right-click and add reference. And then in our program class, what we'll want to do is we're going to want a way to call this. So to keep things, we're going to want to mess around with multiple implementations, I guess is what I'm saying. So for now, let's go ahead and just create a folder for that. We'll just call this implementations. I think I spelled that right. And let's go ahead and add a class in here. We'll just call it test game. Okay, that looks good. And then we want this, we can just leave it in the main space for now. This is just to isolate it and keep it clean. We want this to inherit from game. Bring in our using statements, clear out any that we're not using. Let's go ahead and generate the constructor for it. The constructor, we'll just be calling base, so we should be fine. And then we'll want to implement the abstract classes that actually put them fairly in order, but not this one. That's just my preference. So let's get rid of these exceptions that are set to get thrown. And for now, we'll do GL, and we need to import OpenTK.graphics.OpenGL4. Make sure you're using OpenGL4. And we're going to call clear. And we need to provide it the clear buffer mask. So we use clear buffer mask.color buffer bit. And then we're going to call gl.clear color. And use color 4. which is in the mathematics library. Corn, flower blue. Look, it's going to look just like monogame. So now in order for us to make use of this, we'll go back into our program class, and this is where we're going to be able to swap out any game implementation, so we can make as many as we want that inherit from game, and we can kind of play around with different scenarios without having to reinvent the wheel, and we can just simply go in here and just new up a new instance of that. So our game equals new test game, and these values don't matter for now. We can just do 800. Keep in mind we haven't actually set the windows, where I'm just trying to get us up and running here quickly. We'll go and back and actually set these values correctly here at some point, but that's it for now. Oh, I have these in the wrong order. Okay, and then we just call game.run. And if we did everything correctly, we should get a cornflower blue window. Let's check. There it is. And just to confirm that our methods are being called in here in test game, let's do console. And we'll just pass in game time dot elapsed game time. Let's make sure that's working. It appears to be total milliseconds. That's probably what we make use of. Let's make sure that looks good. Yep, so it's passing that in. Let's make sure render is also calling it. And that looks good. And then our last check would be just to check what the total, make sure that's coming in. We'll do total milliseconds. All right, there we go. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap the series up, or the episode up here. The next, when we move on, we're going to start adding some more rendering components and get a camera built, and we'll start going into shaders, but it's kind of to be determined at this point. So stick around. I will do my best to try to get at least one video out a week. This is obviously not a full-time gig for me. This is my first YouTube video I'm ever making. So I hope this was useful, and we'll catch you in the next video. Like and subscribe or something like that, I guess. I don't really care. You don't have to. This is just for fun.